Someday I'm gonna find myself in the scenario where I'm drawing and my roommate's gonna walk into the room and be like, "Hey, yo, Zillion, what are you doing?" I'm just gonna be like, "Shut up, I'm doing lines!"
So, from the tutorials I've done previously, we know how to sketch. So, now what? How do we make things clean? How do we make things finalized? How do we make colors match? How do we make the character look three-dimensional with light and shadow? This is too much to explain in one video. Each of these subjects would take at least one video each to properly explain. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a 3-part video series on how I tend to finalize my drawings. The reason for 3 is because I tend to break down my work into 3 steps: line work, coloring, and lighting. No one is more important than the other, and they're all pretty essential for a final product. Inevitably, this is my way of doing things, and there really isn't a right or wrong way to do stuff, so you can disregard what I say if you feel like it. Hopefully, though, I'll be able to line out some of the stuff in an easy-to-understand way that you can find your own interpretation for it. Well, enough of me wasting your time. Let's jump into wasting your time. That was stupid. That was really fucking stupid. Why'd I put it in the script? Alright, let's start with line work. Line work is always the first step I take to finishing a picture. Lining, as I would define it, is the final refinement of sketch work. It organizes the sketch into its logical conclusion. It gives solidity and closure to the drawing. Now, the main question that a lot of people would ask is, where would you put lines? Now, this is not an easy question to answer. In retrospect, everybody puts lines in different places and in different spots. How I would define it, though, is you place lines on edges. Now, where to put edges? Edges are a difficult thing to define. What I would define edges as more of a place where you're going to see a visible deviation in a drawing. So places like fur, plating, or just general corners that you're going to see in your drawing. That's where I would put edges. These are all places edges would go, and these are all places lines would go. So when you're referencing an edge, it's from the viewer's perspective, so certain features may not be edges in a drawing. Depending on how you view the character, edges will change and lines will change. So for example, we have this dog thing character. Furry. Fucking furry. It's a fucking furry. It's about time I owned up to this shit. Okay, so what I'm going to make notice of is the muzzle. And it's the nose. It's this area right in here. So we have this general shape of a nose. And when we define this, it's like, yeah, that's the nose of the character. Now, that's not necessarily always viewable because we get this version of the image and the lines and orientations of that same anatomical structure is represented in a very different way. This is the exact same area, but when we take a look at it, the lines are in completely different spaces. And that's because the edges are different in this perspective than it is in the other. For example, the neck right here is fully defined. Whereas if we go back to the other drawing, we have this neck, which is not fully defined. Now, that's a personal choice for me because I know that when people look at this, they can reference the neck going all the way back up here. But I'm not showing it in this version, whereas in this one, I am. It's fully defined there. And that's due to different perspectives will make the character change in its line work, and it's more than just, oh, I'm gonna draw the line in this deviation from that because it's at a slightly different angle. No, it completely changes depending on the perspective in many cases. Oh shit, did I draw something over there? I did. Go away. So the next thing that I really want to go over is underlining and overlining. Now for this, I'm going to actually use an example, and it's a human. Oh my god, people still draw those. Let me go over overlining and underlining. And this is a very important thing to realize, especially when you're going to start getting into drawing a final product. This is what I would consider ideal line work for me personally. Maybe I'd add a little bit more, maybe around the eyes and stuff just to draw attention to it, but this is pretty close to what I'd consider this balance between minimal line work and maximum line work. Let's start off with underlining. What we have here is we have basically the same thing that we saw before, but there aren't as many lines. Underlining will make the drawing look incomplete. You have these underlying structures that you're not able to properly communicate to the viewer. Now, this can be fixed in an underlining situation, and I see a lot of artists do this, and it's definitely a choice that people can make, and that is to actually add the shading. This is that exact same underlined drawing, but with added shading to it, it looks complete. And this is one of the ways that you can actually complete an underlined drawing. Now, let's get to overlining, which is a completely different story. Overlining is kind of when you over detail it in the line work. Overlining will make the drawing very confusing, not only for you, but for the viewers of your artwork. One of the most common places I see this is in fur. In this example, I actually used wrinkles and creases in this guy's faces, but if we actually look at the hair, there's just too many strands up there. And that's not good. Because what ends up happening is you get confused in the details and you don't really know what you're going to be wanting to look at. It's much harder to revise this when you're coloring and shading than it is for an underlined drawing. And for this reason, I tend to stick to the happy medium, which is this one right here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to want to go over is line types. And now we're getting to the meat of this, and this is where I'm actually really excited to teach you, because one of the things that I pride myself in is that my line work is very good. I have this ability to create pretty good lines, and that sounds arrogant as fuck. I spelled it lighting in the script. I don't know why I find that funny. Maybe it's because it's 11 o'clock at night. So there are 3 different line types that I consider. There's equal thickness lines, there's weighted lines, and then there's dynamic lines. We're going to start with equal thickness lines because that's the easiest one to do. Equal thickness lines is pretty self-explanatory. All the lines are the same thickness. Equal thickness lines are normally done with a default brush and are most common among young artists. The reason for this is you can pretty much draw equal thickness lines on any device, whether that be a mouse or a tablet without drivers, you can generally do equal thickness lines. Stylistically, and as you move forward, these aren't necessarily the lines that you want to use. They pose an issue of you might not be able to get them right 100% of the time, and it's very hard to make it look good. There are examples of equal thickness lines that are used quite well. Some good examples are, in fact, most anime is done with equal thickness lines. They're really small, so stylistically, you're able to focus on other stuff in the animation other than the line thickness. Another good example where equal length lines are really helpful is in drafting and in design models, or what is it? Just engineering or in technical drawings. That's the word I'm looking for, technical drawings. They're really useful in technical drawings because you want to communicate this part, not communicate, oh, this looks really artistic. This is magnificent. No, you want to communicate this sense of, okay, this is what it's going to look like. This is not stylized at all. Good, communication's there. Now, weighted lines are a little bit different in the sense that they have variation in line thickness. Now, this variation in line thickness is normally due to pen pressure, though you can code in line thickness in a couple of ways with the mouse that I've seen, though it's not used a lot. Line thickness is the variation of the line's thickness or weight, and the reason most artists use it is because it looks more organic. It feels better to draw with, and it gives a drawing a flow and a more dynamic look. As you look at this versus the old image that I just showed, this one definitely looks like it has more style and it has more character to it. And this is generally the type of style that I use for sketching and just coming up with drawings and stuff, because it feels more fluid and it feels more like a brush or a pencil where you kind of dig it in and it becomes harder and has more volume, whereas when you do an equal thickness, it just kind of feels mechanical in a sense. Now, this is a really good way that I like to sketch, and I have done a couple of commissions where I do it this way. But for me, in a finalized product, I like to use dynamic lines. Now, I'm not sure if this is a term that's generally used in the industry or in the community in general, but this is how I'm going to refer to them because I'm a trendsetter, bitches. Oh, I'm gonna hear it on Twitter. So this is what I would consider dynamic lines, and this is what I personally like to see in artwork, and this is what I like to see myself do, and this is what, or when I see myself perform the best. Dynamic lines is weighted lines with purpose. Now, the reason I say with purpose is because it has this ability to show dimension in your line work, and this is the best looking in my opinion. Now, it's time to go over exactly how to use it. I'm gonna drop the knowledge bomb on you. I'm not going to use that as a catchphrase. That was terrible. The first thing that I'd like to go over when doing dynamic lines is larger, more prominent edges will have thicker lines, and lines with smaller details will have thinner lines. A good example with this is we see the head, which is clearly defined by this very thick kind of outline right here that is very much this thicker line than, say, these little fur tufts, or even the ear tufts right in here, which are inside of this general head shape, and that head shape is inside this general neck shape, and so on and so forth, and that carries throughout the entire body. I'm gonna need to erase all this now. The next thing that we're going to go over is that objects in the front will have thicker lines, while objects in the back will have thinner lines. Now, this is an example of foreshortening. Now, foreshortening is a term used in the artistic community to express a character's three-dimensionality in perspective. So an example, which is right here, which is a kangaroo kind of jumping up and giving a kick, we notice that the lines here on the head are much thinner than the lines here on the foot, which are closer to the camera and closer to viewing. This is called foreshortening, but this is kind of what I'm trying to say, is that objects in front will have thicker lines while objects in the back will have thinner lines. And this kind of is a way of inferring that this is closer, this is farther away. And this is something that you can use to make all of your drawings look more dynamic. And this is a really, really useful tool. It's worth repeating. Lines in the front are thicker than lines in the back. So what I've got right here is I've got this drawing. So we're actually going to be putting these premises into a drawing, and I'm going to be lining this based off of the definitions that I've given in the video. I will slow the video down when I feel like there's something really important to point out, and I'll speed it back up if there's nothing I actually have to talk about. So without any further ado, let's actually just get this show on the road.
So right here we have a basic sketch. This is one that I drew using volumetric shapes and lines. This is very similar to a way I outlined in my basics of drawing tutorial that I did previously. I'll leave a link to that one in the description if you want to go watch it. But we're not here to focus on how I sketch this, we're here to focus on line work. So let's just start out. So when I started this line work, I actually turned down the opacity of the drawing. This is just something that I do when I'm working digitally. Because I'm drawing the head with a slight tilt to the right, I actually have to think about the three-dimensional shape, drawing attention to the muzzle and the eyes and their directionality on the face and on the head. I drew a little tuft of hair on the top, and I'm kind of using the lines sparingly to indicate those creases. For the ears and for the tufts on the side, I add a little bit more volume to the lines because I'm going to want to bring attention to that due to the fact that they are two very prominent features of this anthropomorphic character and anthropomorphic characters in general. So now we're going to move on to the hand or paw or hand paw, fuck it, where I'm going to be drawing the one closer to the viewer. Now, because it's closer to the viewer, we're actually going to be using a theory called foreshortening. Now, foreshortening is basically when an object is closer to the viewer, it's actually going to be larger. And to accentuate this, we're going to be using thicker lines on the hand than we would be using on the head or the rest of the body. Going down the arm, and we see the lines start to get thinner and thinner. So, then we're going to add a little bit of detail on the chest. We're going to add a few hairs to kind of allude to the fact that there is fur there, but it's not an inherent detail at this point of the drawing, and we'll add it later. Hands and paws or feet, or whatever you call them, tend to be a little bit more difficult because there's so much detail embedded in them, and it's so much detail in such a small area. One thing that I would try to keep in mind when doing these areas is to actually be conservative with your line work. It's very easy to overline these parts of the drawings, the hands or the feet and such. And doing that makes them look odd, especially when you understand the anatomy of each of these parts. So just being a little bit careful with your line work is very important. Oh my god, those feet, those foot paws, those feet look terrible. Oh my god. Stop it. Oh god, those are really bad. See, the problem that I'm running into here is that I didn't actually sketch this well enough, and what ended up happening is, because of that, I didn't actually understand what was going on in the drawing when I was doing the line work, because the sketch wasn't as defined as it needed to be. So that's another thing that's very important to realize, is that your sketches need to be defined well enough that you understand where you need to put your lines and how to put your lines down. Because if your sketch work isn't defined, then you're going to be very confused with your lines and you're going to have a very tough time. As you can see right here, I'm actually going to look at it and notice that those paws are looking atrocious. So I'm actually going to go over and redraw them again. And yes, I understand that the legs are a little bit more beefy than in comparison to the arms, and maybe that's just me, or maybe it looks good to you. I don't know. It bothers me. It bothers me. It's just wrong. It's not right. It's like you don't have insanely large feet and just like tiny little hands. It doesn't work like that. Is this all in my head? It's probably just all in my head. Though, I don't know. You're your own worst critic. And I guess every drawing is just practice for the next one. Except if it's a drawing tutorial and it's going to be on the internet forever. Aw, yeah. Son of a bitch. I'm going to be adding a little bit more detail, just a little bit more fluff. One of the ways that I do this is I actually use a brush stroke and then I go over it again with an eraser tool and it creates that nice little edge. I'm going to go over the head a little bit more in a little bit of a darker and a little bit more of a thick brush, and this is actually going to accentuate the head a little bit more and bring more attention to it. And once I'm done doing a little bit more of those outlinings that we do with that dynamic line work that I taught you, it's pretty much done. Well, that went about as well as a functioning alcoholic taking a tour of a whiskey factory. Thank you for watching this Fustercluck of Lining video. I hope you're able to get something out of it, considering my speech tends to be at the pace of either a cheetah on crack or a really hungover snail. Anywho, stay tuned for the coloring and shading video whenever I decide to upload those, which with my upload schedule won't be till next month, because I take my time with my videos and put heart and soul into the Who am I kidding? I procrastinate the shit out of these. Anyways, I'll see you in a month or some similar time frame. Probably. And now, here's some overplayed electronic music and a link to a video that you've either already watched or have no interest in watching. And until that month comes around, happy drawing. That was terrible.